Every morning, Mr. Jonathan Reed followed the same routine. He was one of the richest men in the city, a billionaire who owned several companies and everyone knew his name. Yet despite his wealth, his life was built on strict schedules. He woke up at exactly 5 a.m., drank his specially prepared green juice, read the latest business reports, and then headed to his office in his black luxury car. He was a man who liked control, and nothing in his daily life happened by accident. Jonathan believed that his success came from discipline. He never wasted time on unnecessary things. Even his breakfast was measured by a nutritionist, his meetings timed to the minute, and his wardrobe filled with tailored suits that all looked nearly the same. He liked things simple, quick, and efficient. To him, life was about moving forward with purpose, not about stopping to notice the little things. On this particular day, however, his schedule had a slight change. His driver took a different route because of traffic. Jonathan didn't like detours, but he didn't complain. He simply checked his watch and thought about the meeting waiting for him in half an hour. He was going to meet a group of investors, and every second mattered. As the car passed through a busy street, Jonathan noticed a row of food stalls. It wasn't a place he usually stopped. He preferred expensive restaurants and private clubs, not ordinary street vendors. But his stomach rumbled. He hadn't eaten enough at breakfast because he had been in a rush. Against his usual habits, he told his driver to pull over. The air was filled with the smell of fried snacks, grilled meat, and freshly baked bread. People bustled around the stalls, buying food wrapped in paper or served in small boxes. For Jonathan, this was unusual. He had not eaten street food in years, maybe even decades, but something about the smell, mixed with his hunger, tempted him. He thought, one quick bite won't hurt. I deserve a little change today. He stepped out of his car, adjusting his suit as people turned to look at him. A man like Jonathan Reed rarely walked these streets. His polished shoes, gold watch, and confident walk made him stand out among the crowd of ordinary workers and shoppers. Some whispered, recognizing him, but Jonathan hardly paid attention. He was used to being noticed. At one of the stalls, a vendor smiled eagerly and showed him a plate of steaming hot food. Jonathan pointed and ordered quickly. He didn't want to waste time choosing. He just wanted something to fill his stomach before his meeting. The vendor wrapped the food, handed it to him, and Jonathan paid with a crisp bill that was worth more than what the food cost. As Jonathan took the box in his hand, he thought about how strange this was. A billionaire eating from a street stall. It was almost laughable. He smirked to himself, imagining how his colleagues would react if they saw him now. To him, this was just a small, harmless adventure before returning to his perfectly managed life. He opened the box and lifted a piece of food toward his mouth. The smell was strong, and though the surroundings were far from clean, he was curious. For once, he was letting himself be ordinary, just like the people around him. He thought it would be a small story to remember, maybe even something he could mention as a joke during dinner with other wealthy friends. But what Jonathan didn't notice was that someone had been watching him very closely. A thin boy with messy hair and torn clothes sat by the corner of the street. His eyes were fixed on Jonathan, not with envy for his wealth or his car, but with a deep look of worry. The boy had seen something that no one else had noticed, something about the food Jonathan was about to eat. As Jonathan raised the piece of food higher, the boy's face grew tense. His hands shook slightly, and his lips pressed together as if he was debating whether to speak. People usually ignored him, treating him as invisible because he was homeless. But now, as he saw the billionaire ready to take the first bite, the boy knew he couldn't stay silent. Jonathan, meanwhile, was completely unaware of the silent drama building only a few steps away. He was too focused on himself, his watch, and his meeting. To him, this was nothing more than a quick snack, a small pause before returning to his world of wealth and power. He had no idea that in the next few seconds, his ordinary routine was about to be interrupted in a way that would change his life forever. For years, Jonathan had believed that money could control everything, his time, his health, his future. But in that moment, holding a simple piece of food from a street stall, he was about to discover that life doesn't always follow the plan of the rich. Sometimes fate chooses its own timing, and sometimes wisdom comes from the most unexpected places, even from the voice of a hungry boy on the street. And just as the food touched his lips, that voice finally broke through the noise of the busy market. The boy sat quietly on the corner of the street, almost blending into the shadows of the tall buildings around him. His name was Daniel, though very few people knew it and even fewer cared to ask. At just 12 years old, he had already experienced more pain and hardship than most adults ever would. His small frame was wrapped in an oversized shirt that was torn at the sleeves, and his trousers were patched in several places. His bare feet rested on the cold pavement, dusty and rough from walking endlessly without proper shoes. To most people passing by, Daniel was invisible. He was just another homeless child in the city, one of those faces people pretended not to see. Businessmen walked past him with their briefcases, mothers pulled their children closer, and teenagers laughed as they strolled by, never sparing him a kind word. He was used to being ignored. In fact, he had learned that if he wanted to survive, he couldn't expect kindness. He had to rely on his own sharp eyes, his quick thinking, and sometimes his courage. That morning had been like every other for Daniel. He had woken up near a garbage bin, shivering as the cool dawn breeze swept through the alley. His stomach growled loudly, reminding him he hadn't eaten since yesterday afternoon when someone had tossed him half a sandwich. Hunger was no stranger to him. It was like an unwelcome companion that never left his side. But Daniel had a sharp mind, and even when his belly was empty, he noticed everything happening around him. As the day grew busier, Daniel watched the market street come alive. Vendors shouted to attract customers. The smell of fried food filled the air, and coins clinked as people bought their meals. He sat on the ground, hugging his knees, just observing. For most of the morning, nothing unusual happened, until the sleek black car pulled up near the food stalls. Daniel's eyes widened. He knew from experience that cars like that did not belong here. Out stepped a tall man in a perfectly tailored suit. His shoes shone like mirrors. His wrist carried a watch that probably cost more than the entire row of food stalls, and his confident stride showed he was no ordinary customer. Daniel didn't know who he was, but he could tell instantly that the man was rich, filthy rich. People around the stall also noticed, whispering to each other, some staring in awe, others with curiosity. But Daniel wasn't just curious. He was watchful. His eyes followed every move the man made. When the vendor at one of the stalls quickly wrapped some food and handed it to the stranger, Daniel's stomach twisted. He wanted food desperately, but something didn't feel right. His sharp instincts told him to look closer, and then he saw it. The vendor had dropped the food earlier onto the dirty ground where muddy water had pooled. Daniel had noticed it because he had been sitting there all morning. He saw the vendor pick it up quickly, brush it off, and place it back on the tray as if nothing had happened. The vendor probably thought no one had noticed. And maybe no one else did, but Daniel's eyes missed nothing. Now, watching the billionaire take the food in his hand, Daniel's heart began to race. His small hands trembled on his knees. He knew he should say something, but his mind argued with his fear. Why would a man like that listen to him? He was just a homeless boy, dirty, unwanted, and invisible. If he spoke, people might yell at him, laugh at him, or tell him to stay quiet. Yet he couldn't ignore it. He thought about how sick that food could make the man, how dangerous it was. For Daniel, getting sick was part of his hard life. He was used to fighting fevers and stomach aches without medicine. But someone like that wealthy stranger? What if it poisoned him? What if it harmed him in a serious way? Daniel bit his lip. His stomach growled again, and for a brief second he thought about how unfair life was. He himself was starving, and here was a man with more money than anyone could imagine about to eat food that could be harmful. Life played cruel jokes, Daniel thought. But then he shook his head. It didn't matter who the man was. Wrong was wrong. He looked at the man again, now raising the food to his mouth. Time felt like it slowed down. The sounds of the market faded, and all Daniel could hear was his own heartbeat thudding in his ears. His throat tightened, but he forced himself to gather every bit of courage he had, and then, before he could stop himself, the words burst out of his mouth. His voice was loud, shaky, but filled with urgency. "Don't eat that." Heads turned. People stopped walking. The vendor froze. And the billionaire, startled by the sudden cry, stopped mid-motion with the food just inches from his lips. Daniel's face turned red, and for a moment he thought about running away. But he stayed where he was, his chest rising and falling quickly, his eyes locked on the rich man's face. He didn't care if people laughed at him now. All that mattered was that he had spoken, and the man had stopped. Little did Daniel know, in that single act of bravery, he had just changed not only the billionaire's day, but the course of his own life forever. The moment Daniel's voice broke through the noisy market, the entire street seemed to freeze. His cry, "Don't eat that!" echoed louder than the clatter of pans, the shouts of vendors, and the hum of traffic. People turned their heads sharply, startled that a ragged homeless boy had dared to interrupt a well-dressed, important-looking man. The billionaire, Jonathan Reed, stood there holding the piece of food just inches from his lips. His eyebrows furrowed, and for a second annoyance crossed his face. He wasn't used to being shouted at. People usually lowered their voices around him, treated him with respect, or stayed out of his way completely. Yet here was a trembling child, no taller than his shoulder, daring to cry out at him in front of everyone. The vendor's smile faltered, his hands twitching nervously. He knew exactly why the boy had shouted. He glanced around, hoping no one else had noticed the food drop earlier. Beads of sweat formed on his forehead as whispers spread through the small crowd that had gathered. Jonathan's hand froze midair. His instinct told him to scold the boy, to demand why he had shouted like that. But something about the boy's face held him back. Daniel wasn't smirking or seeking attention. His eyes were wide, his body trembling, and his voice carried a tone that wasn't playful or mocking. It was desperate. The silence stretched for a long moment. Then Jonathan lowered the food slowly and turned his head toward Daniel. His deep voice, calm yet sharp, cut through the murmurs. "What did you say?" Daniel swallowed hard. Every eye on the street was now on him. He wanted to shrink back into the shadows, but it was too late to take his words back. He clenched his fists tightly, trying to stop them from shaking, and forced himself to repeat. Don't eat that, sir." His voice cracked, but this time it was steadier. The crowd erupted in low chatter. Some laughed, thinking the boy was just trying to cause trouble. Others looked curious, waiting to see what would happen next. Jonathan, however, didn't laugh. He stared directly at Daniel, studying him like a puzzle. "Why not?" Jonathan asked firmly. The boy hesitated. His heart pounded so hard it felt like it might burst out of his chest. He knew if he told the truth, the vendor might get angry, maybe even chase him away. But he also knew the man deserved to hear it. I saw him drop it," Daniel stammered, pointing to the vendor. He dropped the food on the ground. The water there was dirty. Then he picked it up and gave it to you. Gasps spread through the crowd. All eyes turned to the vendor, who immediately shook his head and waved his hands. No. "The boy is lying!" the vendor shouted, forcing a laugh.
"He is always here begging, making up stories."
"Don't listen to him, sir. He just wants attention." But Daniel didn't back down. His eyes shone with honesty, and his small body leaned forward as if to prove his point. "I'm not lying," he cried. "I saw it, please. Don't eat it. It's not safe." Jonathan's eyes flickered between the boy and the vendor. He could sense fear in the vendor's face, the kind of nervousness that came from being caught. And in the boy's face, he saw something even rarer. Truth spoken with courage despite the risk. For a few seconds, Jonathan didn't say anything. His usual routine told him to dismiss the boy, to assume he was just another street child causing a scene. But his gut told him otherwise, and Jonathan Reed was not a man who ignored his instincts. He looked down at the food in his hand, then back at the vendor. Slowly, with measured calm, he set the food back on the stall. The vendor's face turned pale. The crowd's whispers grew louder. Some people now eyed the vendor with suspicion. Others glanced at Jonathan, wondering what he would do next. Jonathan turned once more toward Daniel. The boy's chest rose and fell quickly, his eyes still locked on him, waiting for the verdict. For the first time in years, Jonathan felt something unusual stir inside him. It wasn't anger or pride or the usual satisfaction of being in control. It was curiosity, mixed with a strange sense of respect. He took a step closer to Daniel. The crowd leaned in. "You shouted at me in front of everyone," Jonathan said in a low, even tone. "Do you know what that means?" Daniel's lips trembled, but he nodded. "Yes, sir," he whispered. "Then why did you do it?" Jonathan asked. The boy's answer came without hesitation, his voice soft but clear. "Because it was the right thing." The billionaire froze. The words were simple, spoken by a child. Yet they hit him harder than the sound of the boy's initial cry. For years, Jonathan had lived by logic, schedules, and profit. Rarely had anyone spoken to him with such honesty, and certainly not a homeless child from the streets. For the first time in his carefully controlled day, Jonathan Reed's routine had been broken. not by a powerful businessman or a board of investors, but by the sudden cry of a boy who had nothing but his voice and his courage. And though Jonathan didn't know it yet, this cry was the beginning of a story that would forever change both of their lives. Jonathan Reed stood still, holding his breath as the boy's words echoed in his mind. The bustling noise of the market seemed to fade into silence, leaving only the weight of that moment. His hand, which only seconds ago had been ready to put food into his mouth, now hung frozen in midair. Time seemed to stop, and for a man who lived by strict schedules and perfect timing, the sudden pause felt almost unreal. He had always prided himself on being in control of his business, his choices, his time. But here he was, halted completely by the shaky cry of a barefoot child. It wasn't the kind of pause he was used to. It wasn't a pause to check his watch or review a contract. It was a pause that came from something deeper, something he couldn't quite name. Jonathan's sharp eyes studied the boy again. The child stood at the corner, thin arms wrapped around his stomach as though hunger itself was eating away at him. His face carried both fear and bravery, like someone who knew he might be punished but couldn't stop himself from speaking. The boy's voice was still ringing in Jonathan's ears, urgent, raw, and real. The billionaire's chest rose slowly as he let out a breath. His annoyance had melted, replaced by a strange sense of unease. Why had this child's words stopped him? Why did they matter? After all, he was a man of power. He could silence entire rooms with a single command. He could make or break companies with one decision. Yet here, in the middle of a crowded market, the honesty of a homeless boy had robbed him of movement. Around him, the crowd whispered. Some people were amused, waiting for the billionaire to scold the boy. Others were curious, sensing something unusual was happening. The vendor, nervous and sweating, kept insisting that the boy was lying, waving his hands in frantic denial. But Jonathan didn't move. His sharp gaze stayed locked on the boy as if searching for the truth behind his trembling words. For Jonathan, this was a rare moment of vulnerability. His life had always been about trust in numbers, trust in contracts, trust in the power of wealth. He rarely trusted people, especially strangers. Yet something about the boy's desperate honesty pierced through the walls he had built around himself. His fingers loosened, and the piece of food slipped back into the box. He slowly set it down on the stall, his expression unreadable. The vendor flinched, biting his lip, his eyes darting nervously between Jonathan and the boy. Jonathan adjusted his suit jacket, his movements calm but deliberate. The silence stretched as if everyone was waiting for him to explode. But instead of shouting, instead of brushing the boy aside, he stood perfectly still. His powerful figure looked almost out of place in the noisy market. Surrounded by ordinary people, yet in that stillness, he seemed human. Less like the untouchable billionaire and more like a man caught in a moment of unexpected reflection. The boy shifted nervously under Jonathan's gaze. His heart raced, unsure if he would be punished for speaking out. He had seen grown men chase away beggars with sticks, heard cruel words from people who treated him as if he were nothing. Would this rich man be any different? But Jonathan didn't lash out. Instead, his mind replayed the boy's final words. Because it was the right thing. Simple words. Yet they carried a weight Jonathan couldn't ignore. For years, Jonathan had lived in a world where right and wrong were blurred by money and contracts. Decisions were made based on profit, not principle. People around him flattered him, feared him, or obeyed him. But rarely did anyone dare to speak the truth to his face. Especially not a child from the streets. And that's why he froze. Not because of the food, not because of the vendor, but because for the first time in a very long while, someone had spoken to him without fear of his power or his wealth. The boy had nothing to gain, nothing to win, except maybe the satisfaction of saving a stranger from harm. That kind of courage, that kind of honesty, was something money could never buy. Jonathan's jaw tightened. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, waiting for his reaction. But he didn't care. At that moment, he wasn't thinking about his reputation, his meeting, or even the time ticking away on his golden watch. He was thinking about the trembling child who had broken his routine, shattered his pride, and made him stop. For a billionaire who thought he had seen everything in life, this freeze was more than hesitation. It was the beginning of a shift inside him, small, unexplainable, but powerful. He didn't know it yet, but the boy's cry had planted a seed of curiosity, a seed of empathy, and maybe, just maybe, a seed of change. Jonathan Reed remained motionless for a moment longer, his mind caught between the man he had always been and the man he might become. The food lay untouched. The vendor trembled. The crowd waited. And the boy, still standing firm despite his fear, had no idea that his single cry had just frozen the heart of a man who thought nothing in this world could ever shake him. And in that stillness, between pride and humility, between wealth and poverty, between silence and truth, the story truly began. The food sat untouched on the stall, its steam rising into the air, carrying with it the tempting smell of spices and fried oil. To the crowd it looked harmless, just another quick street snack. But for Daniel, the boy who had cried out, it was something far more dangerous. He had seen with his own eyes what others had missed, and his memory of it was sharp, like a wound that refused to heal. Earlier that morning, Daniel had been sitting on the same corner, his knees pulled to his chest, watching the vendors prepare their food. Hunger gnawed at his belly as the rich smell of fried snacks filled the air. His eyes had followed every movement, the sizzling pans, the flipping bread, the careful wrapping. And then it happened. He had watched the vendor, in his rush to serve customers, accidentally drop one piece of food. It tumbled from the tray and landed right in the muddy puddle that had formed beside the stall. The puddle wasn't ordinary water. It was a mix of rain, dust, and oily waste that had trickled down from the street. Daniel had seen rats scurry near it at night, sniffing for scraps. He had seen people spit carelessly into it when no one was watching. The boy's sharp eyes had widened in shock as the vendor picked up the food, brushed it quickly, and placed it back on the tray as if nothing had happened. Daniel's heart had sunk. He knew what that meant. Some unlucky customer was going to eat it. He had wanted to shout even then, but fear tied his tongue. Who would listen to a starving boy? Who would believe him over a grown man selling food? But when the rich stranger stepped out of the black car and pointed to that exact piece, Daniel's stomach twisted. His fear of being ignored suddenly felt smaller than the fear of what could happen to the man if he ate it. He had no choice but to cry out. Now, standing in the tense silence that followed, Daniel could see suspicion in the eyes of some of the crowd. A few of them looked down at the food, then back at the vendor, wondering if the boy was telling the truth. Others shook their heads, whispering that homeless children were known to lie just to get attention. The vendor, desperate to protect himself, laughed nervously. "Sir, don't listen to him," he said, his voice shaky but loud enough for the crowd to hear. "This boy is always here making up stories to get pity. He wants you to buy him food. He lies because that's how he survives." But Jonathan didn't look at the vendor. His eyes remained fixed on the boy. He had seen enough in boardrooms and business deals to know when a man was lying. The vendor's twitching hands, his darting eyes, his forced laughter, it all pointed to guilt. And the boy? His voice had cracked, but his gaze was steady. There was no trick in his eyes, only urgency. Jonathan's mind began to process the situation logically. If the boy was telling the truth, then the food was contaminated. Eating it could mean sickness, serious sickness. Foodborne illnesses weren't something to joke about, especially for someone with a schedule as demanding as his. And if the boy was lying, well, what did the child gain from it? Nothing but risk. He had put himself in danger of being shouted at, humiliated, or even punished. That wasn't the action of a liar. It was the courage of someone who cared enough to speak, even when it could cost him. For the first time in a long while, Jonathan felt a chill run down his spine. He had almost eaten it, almost put something into his body that had touched the filth of the street. He thought of the puddle, though he hadn't seen it himself, and his stomach turned at the mere image. The billionaire turned slowly to the vendor, his voice low but firm. "Is what the boy said true?" The vendor's face turned red. No, sir," he stammered. "I would never—" "Don't lie to me," Jonathan interrupted, his tone sharp enough to slice through the air. The crowd grew silent again. They could sense the weight of his words, the authority behind them. This was not just an ordinary customer. This was a man used to commanding entire rooms. The vendor opened his mouth, then closed it again, his eyes dropping to the ground. His silence spoke louder than words. A ripple of disapproval spread through the onlookers. A few shook their heads. Others muttered under their breath about dishonesty and greed. Daniel stood very still, his small body trembling with both fear and relief. He had told the truth, and now the powerful man seemed to believe him. His heart pounded, but for the first time in years he felt like his voice had mattered. Jonathan, however, wasn't just thinking about the food anymore. His sharp mind was turning over the boy's actions, analyzing them as if he were an investment opportunity. The child had risked humiliation to protect a stranger. That kind of honesty, that kind of courage was rare in the world he knew, a world where people lied for money, for power, for survival. Yet here was a boy with nothing, telling the truth simply because it was the right thing to do. The hidden danger wasn't only in the contaminated food. It was also in the way people like him, wealthy, powerful, always rushing, never stopped to notice the small voices warning them of bigger truths. The danger was in ignoring honesty because of the face it came from. Jonathan straightened his back, his decision made. He would not eat the food, but more than that, he realized something deeper. This boy, this homeless child who had shouted in desperation, had just saved him. And for the first time in a very long while, Jonathan Reed felt humbled. The air around the food stall was thick with tension. The vendor stood pale and restless. The crowd whispered among themselves, and Daniel, the small homeless boy, looked as if he had poured his entire soul into that desperate warning. But all eyes were now on Jonathan Reed, the billionaire whose next action would decide how this story unfolded. Jonathan's chest rose and fell slowly. He was used to being the man in charge, the one whose decisions shaped entire companies, whose choices determined the fate of thousands of employees. But this moment was different. This wasn't about stocks, profits, or contracts. It was about truth, and it was about what kind of man he really was when stripped of power, stripped of luxury, standing face to face with a barefoot child. The crowd waited. Would the billionaire dismiss the boy? Would he turn a blind eye and walk away, pretending nothing had happened? Or would he choose a path that most wealthy men never dared to take, acknowledging the voice of a child no one else cared to hear? Jonathan's sharp gaze fell on the vendor. His voice, calm but icy, cut through the air. "You served me food that fell into filth," he said, his tone more statement than question. "Did you think no one would notice?" The vendor's mouth opened, but no sound came. His shoulders slumped as the truth became impossible to hide. A few people in the crowd gasped. Others shook their heads, muttering about dishonesty. The vendor tried to mumble an excuse, but Jonathan raised a hand, silencing him instantly. The billionaire wasn't a man who tolerated lies. In his world, liars cost millions, sometimes billions. And here, in this small market, he saw the same greed, the same careless arrogance that he had battled in boardrooms. But what struck him harder was not the vendor's dishonesty. It was the boy's courage. A child with nothing to his name had stood against a grown man's lie. He had shouted the truth even when it could have gotten him chased away or mocked. That, Jonathan realized, was the real test happening before his eyes. Not of the vendor, but of himself. What would he do with this truth? Ignore it, as many powerful men would, or honor it even though it came from a boy society had abandoned? Jonathan's heart felt heavier than usual. He remembered how people in his world spoke to him. Always polite, always careful, always afraid to offend. They flattered him, praised him, bowed to him, but none of them dared to shout at him like this boy had. And yet, out of all the voices he had heard in years, this trembling cry was the only one that rang with pure honesty. He looked back at Daniel, who stood stiffly, ready to be punished or humiliated. The boy's thin arms were still wrapped around his belly, his face pale, but his eyes, those eyes held a fire Jonathan couldn't ignore. Jonathan's lips curved into something rare, a faint smile. Not of amusement, but of respect. "What's your name, boy?" he asked. Daniel blinked, surprised. No one had asked him that in so long that for a moment he almost forgot how to answer. Daniel, he whispered. Jonathan nodded slowly, repeating the name as if sealing it into his memory. Daniel. The crowd murmured again. They hadn't expected the billionaire to even speak to the boy, let alone ask his name. Jonathan turned back to the vendor. "This child has more honesty in him than you ever will," he said coldly. "You tried to sell me poison. If not for him, I would have eaten it." His words struck like lightning, and the vendor lowered his head in shame, unable to meet his gaze. Then Jonathan reached into his pocket and pulled out a crisp bill, but instead of handing it to the vendor, he walked toward Daniel. The crowd parted in awe as the billionaire bent slightly and held the bill out to the boy. "You saved me," Jonathan said. That's worth more than this food, more than a lie, more than silence. Don't ever think your voice doesn't matter." Daniel's small hand shook as he accepted the money. His throat tightened. No one had ever thanked him like this. Not sincerely. Not with such weight. His eyes glistened with tears, but he blinked them back, afraid to look weak. Jonathan wasn't finished. He turned to the people gathered and spoke loud enough for all to hear. "Every one of you saw what happened. Most of you stayed silent. Only this boy spoke. Remember this. Sometimes the truth comes from the smallest, weakest voice, and it takes courage to hear it." The market grew silent, ashamed, yet thoughtful. People looked at Daniel differently now. He was no longer invisible. For once his voice had been louder than the noise of the world. Jonathan straightened his jacket, his golden watch glinting in the sunlight. He had passed a test of character that day, a test he hadn't even known was coming. A test not of business, but of humanity. And deep inside, he knew it was Daniel who had given him that chance. The billionaire glanced once more at the boy, and in his heart, he felt something shift. He realized that wealth wasn't measured by the zeros in his bank account, but by moments like these, moments when listening to the truth, no matter where it came from, defined the kind of man he truly was. Jonathan Reed, the man who thought nothing could shake his routine, had been tested in the most unexpected way. And though his stomach remained empty, his heart carried something far richer than food, respect for a boy who had nothing, yet gave him everything he needed to hear. The test was over, but its lesson had only just begun. The market began to return to its rhythm. Vendors went back to calling out prices, customers shuffled to different stalls, and the hum of daily life resumed. But in one corner of that busy street, time still felt different. Jonathan Reed, the billionaire whose life was usually a whirlwind of meetings and decisions, stood quietly, his eyes fixed on Daniel, the boy who had stopped him from making a mistake he would never forget. Jonathan had met thousands of people in his life. Business partners, investors, lawyers, politicians, each of them eager to impress him, to gain something from him. But not one of them had looked at him the way Daniel did, with trembling honesty and not an ounce of greed. The boy hadn't shouted to get money. He hadn't begged for food. He had shouted to save a stranger. That was something rare, something priceless. Jonathan took a step closer. The crowd thinned now, some still stealing glances at the strange sight, the city's wealthiest man speaking to a ragged, barefoot boy. Daniel lowered his gaze, clutching the money Jonathan had given him earlier. He didn't know if he should stay or run. People rarely wanted him around, and kindness always made him suspicious. It usually came with conditions. Jonathan noticed the boy's unease. His voice softened, losing the sharp edge of authority it usually carried. "Daniel," he said, "when was the last time you ate?" Daniel hesitated. He wanted to say yesterday, but the truth was even sadder. He hadn't had a real meal in 2 days, only scraps that others had thrown away. Still, pride made him answer quietly, "I don't remember, sir." Jonathan's jaw tightened. He was a man who spent thousands on a single dinner, a man whose chefs prepared gourmet meals in his mansion. And here was a child who couldn't even remember his last proper meal. The contrast stung him in a way he hadn't expected. "Come with me," Jonathan said firmly, though his tone was not unkind. Daniel's eyes widened. "With you?" "Yes," Jonathan replied. "You saved me. The least I can do is buy you a proper meal." The boy's heart pounded. He wanted to trust those words, but he had been tricked before. People sometimes offered food only to chase him away at the last second, laughing at his hope. But something in Jonathan's voice was different. Steady, sincere. Jonathan gestured to his sleek black car, which still waited at the curb. Daniel froze at the sight of it. He had never been near a car like that, not even in his dreams. The shiny surface reflected the sunlight, and the interior, glimpsed through. The window looked softer and richer than any bed he had ever known. The driver opened the door, expecting Jonathan to get in. But to everyone's surprise, Jonathan turned to Daniel and motioned for him to step inside first. The boy's eyes darted around nervously. He clutched his shirt, hesitant, as if the leather seats might reject someone like him. Jonathan noticed his fear. "Go on," he said gently. "You're safe with me." Slowly, Daniel climbed into the car, his small body sinking into the plush seat. It felt like sinking into a cloud. His fingers brushed against the leather, and for a moment, he forgot about his hunger. He had never sat anywhere so clean, so soft, so humanizing. Jonathan joined him and gave the driver instructions to head to one of the city's finest restaurants. On the way, he glanced at Daniel, who sat stiffly, his eyes wide as he looked out the window. The boy stared at tall buildings, flashing lights, and passing cars as though he were seeing the city for the first time. "Is this your first time in a car?" Jonathan asked. Daniel nodded silently. He didn't trust his voice not to crack. Jonathan leaned back, lost in thought. For years, his car rides had been filled with phone calls, business deals, and endless scrolling through reports. But in this ride, he felt something different. A strange calm, mixed with curiosity about the child beside him. When they arrived at the restaurant, heads turned immediately. Guests in elegant suits and dresses stared as the billionaire walked in with a thin, ragged boy by his side. Some whispered in shock, others frowned in disapproval. But Jonathan didn't care. He placed a hand lightly on Daniel's shoulder and guided him inside. The waiter approached, stuttering with surprise at the unusual pair. Jonathan's voice was steady. "Bring us your best meal, and plenty of it." When the food arrived, Daniel's eyes widened at the plate stacked high with roasted meat, fresh bread, steaming soup, and colorful fruits. His throat tightened. For so long, his meals had been scraps from garbage bins, half-eaten leftovers tossed carelessly by strangers. This was a feast fit for kings. "Eat," Jonathan said simply. Daniel hesitated only for a moment before diving in, his hands trembling as he grabbed bread and tore into it. He ate quickly, almost desperately, afraid the food might vanish if he slowed down. Jonathan watched quietly, a pang of sadness striking his chest. He had seen people eat with greed before, wealthy men stuffing themselves at banquets. But this was different. This wasn't greed. This was survival. "Slow down," Jonathan said gently after a while. "There's plenty. No one will take it from you." Daniel paused, his cheeks puffed with food, his eyes uncertain. Slowly, he nodded and forced himself to eat more calmly. For the first time in a long while, he felt full, not just in his stomach, but in his heart. Someone had seen him. Someone had cared. As the boy ate, Jonathan asked him about his life. Daniel spoke in small pieces, shy at first. He told him about losing his parents, about wandering the streets, about nights spent shivering in the cold. Jonathan listened, really listened, something he rarely did with anyone anymore. The bond between them grew silently across that table. A billionaire and a homeless boy, two people from opposite worlds, found themselves connected by a single moment of truth. Jonathan realized he hadn't just been saved from dirty food. He had been saved from his own blindness, and Daniel, for the first time in years, felt like more than just a shadow in the streets. He felt like a boy again, a boy with a name, a voice, and maybe even a future. That night, as they left the restaurant, Jonathan looked down at Daniel and said words that would change everything. "I think meeting you today was no accident. Maybe it was meant to be." Daniel looked up, his eyes wide with wonder, and for the first time in his life, he allowed himself to believe in something he had long forgotten: hope. The city lights glimmered as Jonathan Reed's car glided through the streets that night. For most people, it was just another ordinary evening, but for Jonathan and Daniel, something extraordinary was unfolding. Two lives, one of unimaginable wealth and one of heartbreaking poverty, had crossed paths in a way that neither of them could ever have predicted. Daniel sat quietly in the back seat beside Jonathan. His belly was full for the first time in days, and yet his mind was racing. The food he had eaten at the restaurant wasn't just a meal. It was like a dream he had been allowed to step into. But even more than the food, it was the feeling of being seen, of being valued, that filled him with warmth. For so long he had been invisible. Tonight he wasn't. Jonathan glanced at the boy every now and then, his thoughts heavy. He had attended countless board meetings, shaken hands on million-dollar deals, traveled across the world for business. Yet none of those experiences had left him feeling the way he did now. This child, a boy with nothing, had shaken him more than any rival, more than any crisis. The car stopped in front of Jonathan's mansion, a grand estate with tall iron gates, glowing lights, and sprawling gardens. Daniel's eyes widened as he stepped out. He had never seen such a place except in magazines discarded in the trash. He stared at the massive doors, the marble steps, the glittering windows, as if he had walked into another world. Jonathan noticed his awe and placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Come inside. You're safe here," he said gently. Daniel hesitated. The thought of stepping into such wealth made him feel small, unworthy. But Jonathan guided him in. The doors opened, revealing a warm hall lit with chandeliers, the air scented with polished wood and fresh flowers. To Daniel it felt unreal. "Sit," Jonathan said, pointing to a velvet chair. Daniel obeyed cautiously, his small frame sinking into the cushions. He looked around, taking in paintings, tall shelves of books, and rugs that felt softer than any bed he had ever slept on. Jonathan sat across from him, his expression serious. "Daniel," he began, "today you changed something in me. You didn't just stop me from eating something bad. You reminded me of something I had forgotten." Daniel tilted his head, confused. "You reminded me that truth and courage don't come from power, or money, or status." Jonathan continued. "They come from the heart. And you, a boy with nothing, showed me more honesty and bravery than most men I know." The boy's lips parted, but he didn't know what to say. Compliments were foreign to him. Nobody had ever spoken to him this way. Jonathan leaned forward. "You shouldn't be living on the streets, Daniel. You deserve food, education, safety, a chance at life. And I want to give that to you." Daniel's eyes widened. His heart pounded in disbelief. You mean?" "Yes," Jonathan said firmly. "From today, you won't sleep on the streets again. You will live here with me. I'll make sure you go to school, that you're taken care of. I'll give you the future you deserve." Tears welled up in Daniel's eyes. He tried to blink them away, but they spilled onto his cheeks. For years he had dreamed of being saved, of someone reaching out a hand to pull him from the darkness. But life had taught him not to expect it. Now here was a man he had saved with just a shout, offering him everything he had ever needed. Daniel dropped his gaze, his voice trembling. "Why me? You're rich. You could help anyone. Why me?" Jonathan smiled softly, though his eyes carried a weight of truth. "Because you helped me first. And because sometimes life chooses the right people to cross paths. Today life chose you and me." The boy's small body shook with silent sobs, a mixture of relief, gratitude, and overwhelming emotion. Jonathan stood, walked over, and placed a hand on the boy's head gently. "You're not alone anymore, Daniel," he said. That night, Jonathan arranged for Daniel to have his own room. It wasn't just any room. It was decorated with clean sheets, soft blankets, and a small desk with books and toys. For Daniel, it felt like a palace. He touched everything with trembling hands, afraid it might vanish if he closed his eyes. When he lay down on the bed, the softness embraced him like a hug he had long been denied. For the first time in years, he slept without fear of the cold, without the sound of rats, without hunger gnawing at his belly. He slept as a boy should, safe, warm, and loved. Days turned into weeks, and Jonathan's promise held true. Daniel was enrolled in school, where he struggled at first but quickly showed how sharp his mind was. Teachers were surprised at how quickly he learned, despite his rough past. At home, Jonathan encouraged him, spending time with him in ways he never thought he would with anyone. They shared meals, conversations, even laughter. In return, Daniel brought something priceless into Jonathan's life: joy, simplicity, and perspective. For a man who had once measured success by wealth, Daniel reminded him of the value of kindness, of connection, of humanity. The world soon learned of the story, the billionaire and the homeless boy. Newspapers wrote about it, people whispered about it, but Jonathan didn't care for the attention. This wasn't charity for show. It was real. It was personal. One evening, as they sat in the garden under the stars, Daniel turned to Jonathan and whispered, "If I hadn't shouted that day, if I had stayed quiet." Jonathan smiled, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Then maybe I would have gotten sick." But more importantly, I would have missed meeting you, and that would have been the greatest loss of all. Daniel's lips curved into a small smile. For the first time in his young life, he believed in a future that was more than survival, a future with hope, a future where his voice mattered. And Jonathan Reed, the man who once thought nothing could break his perfect routine, now knew the truth. Sometimes the greatest fortune isn't measured in money, but in the people who change our lives when we least expect it. From that day on, both lives were forever changed. The billionaire who learned the value of compassion, and the homeless boy who discovered that even the smallest voice could rewrite destiny.